That just gave me chills, like literal chills down my body. That was a lot of energy. That was awesome. The one thing that also makes me think of is I think there are moments in history that we experience that are full of trauma for everyone. I think one of the biggest ones, and I saw a video of you talking about this, was 9/11. Talk to me about that and how it was going through that, especially in Texas and the South.
Yeah, I mean, it was in a lot of ways. I think you could probably imagine. And if you're listening and you don't see me, like I wear a turban, I have brown skin, I have a beard, and from the day of 9/11, my life sort of changed immediately, and I went from being seen as someone who was different or foreign or an outsider, however people saw me, and and like that came with its own problems and challenges. But now I was seen as people's enemy, and people were angry, understandably. People were upset, understandably. They were hurt, understandably, and a lot of times their feelings were channeled towards me and people who look like me. So it was really confusing in a lot of ways. As in, I was 18. I was trying to figure out my own life, and now all of a sudden, I had to figure out how to deal with other people seeing me in a way that didn't match up with how I saw myself, and that's a hard thing. And I think I my experience of it was extreme, right? Like not all of us are
Mhm.
seen as enemies, but all of us deal with people's judgments. We know that people are assuming things about us all the time based on how we look or what we wear or what language I mean, what accent we have. I mean, there's so much that people are judging about us. And so, um, that period, I mean, it was scary for a while with the death threats we were getting at home and that kind of thing. But I think one of the biggest lessons for me coming out of it was understanding that you can't control how people see you, and you can't tie your happiness to their judgment or their assumptions, because if you do that, and so many of us do, right? And um, my life, it might have been that particular issue, but like with social media, with the ways that we're thinking about beauty standards, I mean, there's so many reasons why we're so focused on what other people think about us, and realizing, I think for a lot of marginalized folks, we have to learn this, um, that if we keep focusing on other people's perceptions of us, like we're just stuck. Like there's nowhere to go with that. And ultimately, we have to find a way to be happy with ourselves and be proud of who we are. And I think that's a different kind of inner work. It's a journey. It's a lifelong journey, but it's the only way out, I think.
I think it's such a good point, and I think it's so hard to find like your own center and be proud of like who you are as a person and in all of your identity and aspects of your identity. And I think to what we were talking about before, I think as well is like talking to other people makes it easier. I think I remember talking to one of my friends in high school, who was Middle Eastern. His name was Vishnu. Shout out Vishnu. Still good friends now. But we were just having kind of a funny conversation. He was like, "Man, it is so rough looking like me." And I talked about being black, and like we went to a predominantly white school, and we just talked about our experience. I remember it was after we were playing basketball. We would go down to the rec, play basketball for an hour or so, and then we would, chill and talk for a while. And I remember just talking and having it just massively expand my experience of also not feeling alone. Like I felt like he understood aspects of what it meant for me, and I feel like he felt like he had someone who he could vent to and talk to, and it just made it easier. Like like it wasn't like all of the things that we were going through disappeared after that conversation. But to your point of like light, like it felt like there was a light because I could look in the darkness. There was someone else who could relate, and I think those type of things are just so incredibly important.
Yeah, so important. And it's like, I don't know. It's this funny thing about racism. I mean, we often talk about racism as like divide and conquer strategy, right? Like they make you feel like um, you're competing against one another, and then that competition turns toxic, right? And it's true. Like that's part of what happens. But one of the things we don't talk about is how that divisive approach then results in feelings of isolation. Like I remember, I mean, it's so funny because like I knew so many people from different kinds of minoritized backgrounds growing up. Um, and I knew they had challenges, right? It's not like, I mean, it was Texas, so it was the 90s, like things were rough. Um, but I never considered, I don't think, maybe I did, but like I don't recall considering that the challenges that I went to in terms of my own racism was in any way connected to theirs. And like, it's not just like back then we didn't talk about intersectionality. And so there was like this whole like, my community is my community and our challenges are our own. And you don't really talk about them. Um, but it was also like kind of what you were just describing right now. Like we knew about anti-black racism. We studied slavery in school. We knew about Jim Crow. Like it wasn't like I didn't know about that, but like I never looked at my black friends and were like, "Oh, you would understand what I'm going through if I told you." Like it didn't feel like they were comparable. And I think that feeling it was so hard to overcome. And eventually I realized that like there was actually liberation and community in recognizing that actually it's not just about you. You're not the only target and you don't have to figure it out yourself. So yeah, that was a really long process for me too.
I mean, it was funny how the conversation, like, and once again, this context is key. I say it here, and it may sound crass, but I think part of it was we talked about going into gas stations and being followed around in gas stations or going into stores and having people kind of like treat you like already like you're going to do something wrong. And I remember him saying casually, and I remember I've never forgotten this. And it was funny, it was just like off the hand comment, just like kind of a chuckle thing of like, he's like, I'm glad we could make it easier for black folks for a little while, like after that, which is like kind of like obviously not like a politically appropriate joke or whatever. But I remember it actually meaning something to me of like, you don't make that joke unless you understand the context. And I understood our relationship. And so that's what made the joke funny and something that wasn't just funny, but was meaningful to me of like, man, we can joke about this because we do have similar experience. And I think that's the fundamental joy of laughter. I think sometimes we forget that, especially when we look at comedy, is it's a release of a shared experience. That's why we can find it funny. And I think especially when you work in this field, everyone expects you not to laugh at Dave Chappelle or laugh at funny jokes when it's like, look, like I don't have to agree with what someone is saying or their political views to find what they're saying funny. Right. So I think it's one of those things that is really, really interesting in kind of this conversation we're having that just reminded me of. But yeah.
Yeah, no, it's totally true. I think that's my experience too. That like, um, and I talk about this in my book too. Like to some degree, I think humor, like what you described, makes sense. And then humor for me has also been like a coping mechanism. Like not just like in one sense, a coping mechanism for um, dealing with situations when they feel intense, like de-escalating in some ways.
Yeah.
Um, or like in my own head, like not having to deal with them. Um, but also like post facto, like the incident happens, then you're with your friends and you're like, yeah, that was crazy, and you just start, like that
Yeah.
kind of thing is really helpful too. So like as you're talking about like trauma and you know challenge and difficulty, like humor is actually a really important element in my own experience, and I know for a lot of people who share this experience too.